Welcome to the WEEL Reading Group for October 2024. And today we're honoured to be joined by Dr. Krzysztof Jankowski from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University to present his recent article published in the British Journal of Sociology, Positioning Precarity, the Contingent Nature of Precarious Work in Structure and Practice. Before we begin, a bit of brief background. Dr. Jankowski's research lies at the intersection of employment precarity, adulthood, and urban sociology. Through empirical work into migration, global culture, employment, and urban lifestyles, Krzysztof draws on critical readings of late modernity to investigate ways of being in contemporary society. And this focus has taken him from the streets of the nightlife district Lan Kwai Fong, the global shopping malls and flea markets of Hong Kong, and London's contingent labour market to explore how processes break down and reconstruct ways of being and experience. Dr. Jankowski has published widely from his research in world-leading journals, for example, the British Journal of Sociology, the Sociological Review, Urban Geography, and Ethnographies of Work, amongst others. So welcome then to Dr. Krzysztof Jankowski, who will now present his paper, Positioning Precarity, the Contingent Nature of Precarious Work in Structure and Practice. Over to you.
Solutions that drive it. And at the end, I'll sort of talk about some points beyond what is in the article. So I think it's important to know who the author of anything is. So I guess I didn't realize there's going to be a full introduction, but I'm from New Zealand, and yeah, as Caroline sort of stated, I did research in Hong Kong. This is for my MPhil, looking at travellers, and then I was interested in how travellers sort of feel out of place, and I wanted to apply that to citizens. And so this led me to studying insecure work, which I pursued as a PhD at Glasgow U. So I entered into this project not as a labor sociologist, not as a Marxian researcher, and I wasn't sort of motivated by the same things that a lot of researchers are, which is sort of the problem of work. I was more interested in how people can find their place in the world and the issues that they are facing, and that sort of comes out in the article. And yeah, currently I'm a sort of postdoc at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So just to introduce what is this article. So the idea is, the premise is sort of caught between two observations. The first is that this traditional sort of trifecta that is going on in precarity research of insecurity, harm, and risk is fundamental to understanding work today, but alone is insufficient to understand what a job is or could be. So there's just things about getting a job, of no matter how bad it is, that you can't sort of describe purely through insecurity. And then the other premise that I sort of talk about in the next slide a bit more is, how do we theorize the heterogeneity of precarious work and precarity? And so these problems are sort of solved through the sort of catchphrase of the article, which is contingent in structure and practice. And so what this means is that precarious work is often very contingent. So because it's work that has been sort of stripped of all of its fortifications against the market, it's also quite contingent, where they kind of start suddenly and they can end suddenly. And at the same time, worker practice is also contingent, where they are sort of responding to sort of short-term circumstances, or yeah, and they're sort of reacting to the field as they sort of perceive it. And then putting all this together, if we look at precarious jobs from the worker's perspective, also known as phenomenology, they're all these negative things that we know, but for workers, they're also something else, which is kind of like the first job, or the only job, or the best job that they can find. And for this paper, so I'm an ethnographer, and so I did a in ethnography, where I sort of spent nearly a year working, meeting people, and then it wasn't planned to be during COVID-19, but it was COVID-19. So this is sort of the background for the field work. However, the interviewees obviously were reflecting on things from before that. So the literature for the article is sort of based around like a sort of pretty established tension that exists, where basically on the one hand you have this homogeneity of causes where there's this huge structural change of worse employment conditions, more expensive consumer goods, housing is more expensive. And so all these things are sort of affecting everyone in sort of the same way. But on the other hand, there's a heterogeneity of outcomes. So jobs are not uniformly precarious. There's a whole huge breadth. So you can sort of think of like the freelance wedding photographer and the 0-hour care worker are in some forms of literature are both precarious jobs, and both those individuals are precarious workers. But they are just so different that it's difficult to kind of put together. And concepts that did put them together, like guy standing and the precariat, have sort of been rejected. And this is a problem also that is recognized by like really sort of conservative labor sociologists, really radical Marxian people, post-structuralists, and yeah, just the whole breadth is sort of facing this problem. And then Isabel Lowry, who is a political theorist, she summarizes it really well and says, it is not what is the same, but what is shared by all. And so this is kind of another way of saying it is the outcomes are not the same, but the causes are shared by all. So, however, there are some, while this is widely regarded, or widely recognized as sort of the problem that everyone sort of sees, and there are different solutions, across the way it's been, the heterogeneity has been theorized, there are some sort of issues. The first is that the cases cannot be reconciled. So as I sort of said, you have like the idea of like a freelance photographer and the care worker. They're both precarious, but beyond that, it's not really clear exactly why you would put these in the same category. And then the second point is controversial in essentialism to precarization. So this is a bit like saying feminism as an essentialism to gender almost. But there's this kind of background that there's an assumption that there's sort of this progressively and worsening insecurity that is sort of affecting everything. This is how this homogeneity is understood. And that kind of, I think that sort of shoehorns you into the third point where there's sort of an essentialism to a precarious subject that is secondarily made secure. And so no one would subscribe to this view. No one actually says this view, but I feel like through the practice of actual analysis and writing and doing research, this is kind of a kind of implicit model that some people are sort of taking, and it's quite common across how this literature tension is being handled. And then you could accept that if you want, but there's sort of issues when you sort of look at the data that don't fit that. So, so my solution was to turn to landscape and Merleau-Ponty and Bourdieu. So landscape is a sort of very minor but established concept that apparently goes back to the 1940s as sort of an alternative to positivism, but it's been evolved and changed through the decades. You can think of it much like a field in Bourdieusian theory as it's sort of the sort of phenomenological world that people are observing and interacting with. The landscape is material as well as social. Another thing about landscapes is they have characteristics. So they are an idealization of a characteristic. So you can think about the idea of a landscape painting of like a mountain range, and the painter is not aiming for photorealism. They're trying to make the mountain range look more majestic than it does, to exaggerate that characteristic. And so in my landscape, the characteristic is contingency, and this creates this idea of the contingent landscape. And this can be thought of as the agglomeration of all contingent work, or the tendency for contingency in work. So by that, I mean everything from 0-hour contracts to freelancing to selling things on Etsy to gig platform work to sort of adjunct one semester lecturer teaching, and just anything that sort of doesn't really have that durability of a permanent job. And so on the screen in italics, I have some extra things to help us understand what this is, but these are not definitions. So sort of a segmentation of the world of what is contingent. And so here, segment is too solid. Contingency is sort of more nebulous. And some other things about this approach is it does not assume anything about the subject. So we're not saying there's a contingent subject or a precarious subject. There's just a person in all their full existence, a gendered, classed, physically located individual with aspirations and interests and stuff that is observing and interacting with this contingent landscape. And some other sort of ideas about what this is. People can ignore the contingent landscape, and there are people that do not live in this. So maybe this is true, maybe not, but there are people that are sort of, I guess, firmly in the world of permanency and assuredness and are not concerned about the contingency of the things around them. And the other thing about landscape is, if you sort of go back to the idea of the mountain range, you're standing in it, and there are places that are closer to you. And you can imagine if you have a background in hospitality, you would be in like the valley of hospitality work, where those jobs are very close to you and you understand them. And you could climb into the next valley of like warehouse work, but it would take you time to get there, and you wouldn't know how to live there. And at the tops of the valleys, there's like very visible work, like employment agencies and gig work that everyone can kind of see from their sort of specialisms. And so the idea is that there's this consistent landscape which people are located in very different ways. And at the bottom, there's some sort of like ideas of what you can imagine these contingent things are. So turning to the data and the fieldwork now, I'm not from the UK. I went to London for the first time to find these jobs, and the first impression was, this is difficult. How do I get hired? This was during COVID-19, so the occupations that I have experience in, and sort of clerical and hospitality work, they were shut down. So I had to find work in warehouses and factories and in gig work. And there was also a very bureaucratic hiring process, like forms, seminars, IDs, address proof, and the jobs are kind of like fleeting. So you could apply for a job and then complete all the paperwork, and then a few days later, someone else has got it before you could get it. And at the same time, amongst all this difficulty, when I did get a job, they would start tomorrow or tonight or this weekend. Or I would apply for a job in March, and then 6 months later, they would kind of email me and say, there's a spot, can you come in for an interview next week? So there's this instantness to it. And then if you lose your job, you just go back into it. You just go find another job that starts very quickly. So there was obviously a consistency to sort of living like this that all these different people were experiencing. And it wasn't necessarily something that is not the same, but is the same. There's a pattern, there's a discernible lifestyle, there's stability, there's logic. This was evident in being able to share experiences with interviewees and being able to interact in line with this logic, such as people sort of semi-gossiping or learning or talking about different agencies. And do you know any good agencies that have work going and this type of thing? So there was sort of a culture basically existing around it. And it was starting to make way, in a sense, beyond just risk. Like, you can't really explain someone offering you a job tomorrow through insecurity, risk, and loss, even though those factors are very important to a job like that. So yeah, so the analysis for the article is basically the idea was to, I began the article focusing on the contingent landscape, and I wrote 2 drafts that were just this concept, and they weren't really articles, they were just sort of a huge, just 8,000 words of literature and theory that didn't really say much. So for this article, the idea was to try and develop these 3 different positionalities in relation to the contingent landscape to show to show the depth and the texture to the landscape. And so these 3 jobs that I have here, these are not the final 3 existence of precarious work, and they're not the end of the analysis. They're just sort of 3 themes of constructions that I've sort of found, and you could have a data sample that has a completely different set of sort of worker outcomes. So yeah, so the idea with these is, so the first job is when someone has less concern about the job quality and they're just trying to find something as fast as possible. So the quintessential interviewee for this was a guy who had a 1-year gap year before starting university. So he didn't have 6 months to find the best job or like a good job or a non-precarious job. He just needed something he could start fast and that paid and wasn't too bad to do. And so he became a bike delivery person. And so doing bike delivery is an unsecured job. He had some problems with his manager, but overall he was okay with it, and he felt like it was fine. And then the other one is the only job, which is where you try and find a good job, like a job that you really want, like maybe being an engineer or something, as one interviewee did. And then when no one sort of hires you, then you're like, oh, well, this 0-hour warehouse job is the only thing I could find. And again, it's not ideal. And this warehouse could be very tough to work in. Some people really hated it. But the interviewee, he sort of said, it's okay. At least I got a job. And then the third sort of construction is the best job, which is when someone sort of ceases searching for a new or better work and sort of settles on what they have and sort of realize that this is the best job they can find. So these best jobs it's not the freelance photographer. They're still the same sort of like minimum wage, low status jobs that we think of in precarious work, but they're, for that person from their position in the landscape, it's the best they can find. And then what was the other point? I think that's all for best job. So the answer to sort of these different circumstances is a factor of the worker. Yes, so each of these is a circumstance that is consistent, right? So there's sort of the circumstance of needing to find a job quickly, only being able to find a certain job and the best job, right? But how that circumstance is answered is a factor of the worker and what job is sort of closest to them and what they experience to get into. So and amongst like an academic crowd, if we had to find a job as soon as possible, you know, it might be sort of be like copy editing, or, you know, as I said, adjunct lecturer or something like this. But then someone else, it might be something different. So these sorts of, I think, quite provocative questions in the middle are these sorts of, it's to sort of get at this, like how it's sort of specific to each person. And the overall thing to take away from all of this, and what is interesting about this, is that the characteristics that make a job insecure, such as being on a 0-hour contract, also lend them to being the first, only, or best job. So because 0-hour contracts are really insecure, and the employer can just fire you, you know, informally halfway through a shift and never see you again, that also means they can hire people very quickly. It also means they are prone to hiring people quickly, and it's not a universal truth, but in UK society today, insecurity and sort of first jobs are sort of crossover, and due to the way that the UK economy is structured and the way that employers operate, and just all these sorts of local institutional ways that it sort of works. So that's the article, the key points of it. But I just sort of want to touch on some ideas sort of beyond the article that I can't really sort of, that don't really sort of fit in a journal article, or that I didn't have the words to put in. So there's a question of like, what are these, like, first, only, and best job? So I tried to make my concepts deliberately non-conceptual. So this is sort of why they have these names. But they're also the practical appropriation of contingency by workers. Another way of saying this is, sort of to use a Bordeusian quote, they are the object of social knowledge. And so they're the positional, phenomenological existence of a job for the worker. And they're embedded in the wider picture of the individual's perception of the labor market in their own life. But there's a question here of, is there a more developed answer to what is going on, rather beyond these three constructions? And this sort of goes into the second point. Where does this leave precarious work and precarity? Well, it's actually generally described by big theory, such as Isabel Lowry, but sort of quite across the neoliberal governmentality literature and stuff. Insecurity is sort of normal, universal, a matter of degree, and a contemporary construction of this sort of insecurity, security existence in contemporary society. However, this ethnographic and landscape-based approach sort of shows a lot more detail and consistency to just sort of saying precarity is universal. And we kind of see what are the structures of precarity. The structures seem to be this sort of contingent availability of work. The contingent landscape is one approximation. So the more developed answer to the article is the contingent landscape. And then I think this feeds into some possibly emerging questions, maybe in your sub-discipline or your area. These questions are not emerging and are very well established, but to me they are. So there's sort of this idea of, how is precarious work stable or a utility in people's lives? What supports and enables one to be precarious? And finally, how do we appreciate participant responses who say that their precarious job is not ideal, but is fine. And I think that's a challenge. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Krzysztof. Really enjoyed the paper. Thanks for your presentation there. Just to say, if anybody wants to ask a question now, you can raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat box. Don't forget, we are recording. So if you prefer not to be visible or have your voice recorded on the recording, please put your question in the chat box. Otherwise, just raise your hand and we'll field your questions to Krzysztof. Right, okay, well, maybe you want some time to think about that. So I was thinking about this type of precarious contingent work, and I thought it rather connected with some of your work, Vivian. Do you have a comment?
Oh, Krzysztof, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really very instructive and enlightening. What I have realized from your presentation is that you, in the whole path you had in your research, is that you have successfully touched the two main, let's say, structure, the structural the main structures of labor market and how businesses search for this kind of quick job, quick hiring, quick firing. And on the other hand, we do have people and people's lives and what are their conception, acceptance or not. So my first feeling was, while the main part of your presentation was about how people, how workers, how they accept, it became to me quite obvious that who is benefit from that. And in that question, it seems that it's the whole businesses that they have created this precarity because it's easy, it's fast, and it ends fast. So it's a kind of cycle with ups and downs. And another thing that probably it makes sense to discuss more is, and you said, you talk about that, it's about precarity and what exactly is or how can theorize this concept and what can we see for the future? Is this precarity is gonna last forever? It came from the 90s, it appeared from the 90s, and then it seems like we are gonna live with that for many years. So probably we need to have some insight about theorizing precarity. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, the last point is about how, I mean, that's the most important one, I think, about it becoming normal. And I mean, and it's always been normal at the same time. But I think contingency helps to theorize what that will be and how it will operate in this, because we sort of, I guess something I can talk about is how the apparatus of contingency is sort of greater today. So, even something like a 0-hour contract is actually quite different from purely informal work. So there's a greater capability to be contingent today that I think will sort of continue. So things like minimum wage, and also workplace safety. Everywhere I worked was very safe. And so you could sort of go into these workplaces not knowing what you're going to be doing or who you're even working for. Because the apparatus is sort of growing, and so I think, it will just, I don't know, it will continue, but in a way that we can't predict because we don't know how workers will sort of interpret it in these different ways, I think.
Thank you. Sarah, you've got a question, you've got your hand up. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your paper. I also really enjoyed it, and I want to follow up too just on what Vivian was saying, because I think the point about who benefits, and there's obviously some people who benefit from workers who benefit in a precarious economy, and that's part of what makes it so effective. And so there are obviously entrepreneurs that that some benefit actually and are part of the creation of these systems. But I'm also, as an Antipodean, was really interested in your account, because for me, a lot of what you have also written in here is very classed. And to us Antipodeans, we don't often see the class systems in the precarious work, particularly in London and other places, in the same way. We see different things, but we might not see the same things. And then, so is there a reason you specifically didn't kind of address or couldn't address class? And the other thing is also gender. So you mentioned the bike options, and there has been some work on the bike careers in London and the kind of macho, kind of the male cultures of those. And so that in some ways that's a great job to do if you are wanting a bit of freedom and autonomy, maybe less now than when some of those studies were done, but there's a really gendered element to being able to cycle around London on the streets and feel less vulnerable, possibly. So there's a kind of some elements of that. I wondered what you were doing with those. I mean, obviously you can't do everything, but why, what you had to do just to decide to kind of, I read the paper a little while back, so I'm feeling like it's less so than it might be, but what's happened to kind of class and to gender in these kind of analysis, in your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, this is a big, this is the weakness of the theoretical model, basically. So I guess I'll start with the field, where in the field, it's very complicated. So I would observe mostly sort of ethnic and gender, I guess sort of class differences, where in North London, I would go to a warehouse and I think sort of 80% of the staff are Black men. And then you go to West London and 80% of the staff are from like from the EU, but the EU6, like the countries that joined most recently, like Hungary and Poland and Lithuania and stuff like that. And then another place, sort of half the staff are Indian and straight from India. They're not sort of UK Indian. They're like Indian from India. So there's all these interesting, very important stratifications. Also inside workplaces. So some duties will be so like packaging up goods, that's all women, and then other duties are sort of 50-50 men and women. And then, but the problem about making these types of statements is that you also have the Latin cleaning sector. Cleaning is the sector, but all the workers are from Latin America, in London, sort of 80% or something. And then when I applied to these jobs, I couldn't get in. I was a cleaner for sort of 4 years, and I sort of said this, but I didn't even get a reply. So there's this strange sort of filtering and gatekeeping into different jobs, and then your class and your gender can sort of get you into a sort of more comfortable job, not necessarily more pay, but it's just this this sort of like, I don't know, it's like stratified by sort of in these sorts of unexpected ways. And so this is where and this is something that the contingent landscape, or the landscape perspective, is addressing, where people are sort of in these different positions in the landscape, and there are different jobs that will sort of hire you very, very quickly. They will hire you sort of tomorrow. So yeah, so bike delivery, if you're a woman, the bike delivery company might just kind of say, oh, women always quit after a week or something, and just not hire you tomorrow. But if you're a man, they might just sort of hire you tomorrow. So it sort of operates in this type of way. And then yeah, and I just sort of saw my position as trying to get a handle with all of this stuff that's going on, and then particular segmentations can sort of come further down the line. But it's absolutely 100% segmented in the way that you expect, by like segmented by the privileges that you expect, but you know, for example, sort of white university graduates can go into hospitality work a lot easier than sort of non-white, non-university graduates. But the hospitality work is the way that it's better. It's not more secure. It's a more comfortable, it's more social, it has a higher status working environment than say like a factory or something. So it's also sort of segmenting people by working conditions more than sort of security or pay. But yeah, these sorts of things are sort of, yeah, definitely going on. And yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, I liked this concept of the landscape, and I'm wondering how that changes by the kind of physical landscape, you know, across the different countries that you've looked at.
Well, it's yeah, I'm in Hong Kong now. I'm trying to get to grips with it, to be honest. I was trying to find some employment agencies in Hong Kong, and they don't seem to exist. I mean, it actually, it seems to, it's weird because they're all capitalist and you're all sort of under pressure to work. However, there's different employers, there's different sectors, and there's different pressures on workers as well, that are sort of affecting it. And so something that I'm sort of always thinking about here in Hong Kong is it's very common to stay in the family home until you're married. So just, it's not sort of a conservative religious thing, it's just sort of a practical thing about Hong Kong people. And they yeah, so you sort of have people in their 30s that are still living at home. So there's much lower financial pressure. So I wonder if that sort of allows people, you know, maybe they're not sort of gunning for the first job they can find all the time. Maybe they're sort of the Chinese terms laying flat, kind of not really sort of doing much, and taking their time. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to make sense, doesn't it, really? Yeah. I also wondered, like in the paper, that some people were saying that these jobs, these precarious jobs, were the job of choice, that sometimes it seemed to be paid more. And it's almost like, you know, I was thinking in Bourdieu's logic of practice, to refuse what is anyway denied in this landscape, getting a permanent job with the better paying conditions and more security seems to be the uphill struggle if you're down in the valley, and it's hard to change. And also, given your time in the field as the ethnographer, maybe there was some kind of pressure to present that was a choice. Do you have a comment to make about that?
Present what? Present the choice of what?
That it was their choice of, you know, their favorite choice was to be in a precarious position.
Well, those people, not all, it's just those interviewees were sort of reflecting on, well, I mean, I think the question was for those interviewees, some of those prompts, the question was, do you want a permanent job? And they kind of said, I don't know, not really. Because they have grown up in an environment where temporary work is completely normal, and a permanent job in the UK is so precarious already that they're not really sort of attracted to it. But there is, in terms of myself sort of presenting this, I mean, yeah, there's probably a pressure to sort of you know, conduct an analysis in this way, yeah. But I think I'm putting it out there for other people to either confirm or to say that no, this is wrong. There's people don't think like that or something, or the circumstances can change a lot or something like that. I mean, that's I think that would be interesting, and this goes into this final point of like, what is sort of the stable, precarious job? Does it exist, and what are the circumstances of that? And is it fair to kind of label something with these types of words?
Thank you. One Zhang. Sorry if I mispronounced your
Yeah,
name.
I'm Yuan. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I want to follow up the question about the landscape. Yeah, is there any like a boundary of the landscape, the contingent landscape, and also, if I understand correctly, you want to collect like subjective and objective factors together. Yeah, again, is there any like a line or boundary between these subjective and objective factors? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so with the breadth or the boundary, it's kind of you can kind of put down a very firm boundary as anything that is sort of permanent is sort of not part of the contingent landscape, but there's also the sort of existential reality that nothing is permanent. So so even a permanent job, the company could be restructured and you could be made redundant, in which case it would sort of be quite contingent on market forces. But that, I think, is sort of quite a different situation. So there's sort of the neat answer is the boundary sort of lies at sort of work that is sort of palpably, as in palpable, permanent. So so it will sort of last compared to the span of like a human working life. They will kind of last a large portion of it, where the individual can act and live as if they were permanent. So that's a very sort of long-winded way to find a boundary, but I think that sort of gives it. And then sort of subjective and objective. The constructions of only best worst would be a melding of subjective and objective in sort of the Bourdieusian manner as an object of social knowledge. And then in this regard, you could never have a first job without sort of a first worker, because then it would just sort of be it would just be a precarious job. And at the same time, you could never have well, I don't sort of label these individuals as sort of precarious workers or first workers or anything, but these individuals, to sort of be in the situation they are in, they need these contingent things. So so there's so I wouldn't sort of really put a firm boundary between the subjective and the objective and the phenomenological tradition of Bourdieu and Merleau-Ponty.
Thanks. Karen, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It was fascinating. I've got two questions. I may have to sort of leave partway through, but what I'm interested in is, did you see any evidence of escapers from precarious work? And were there also workers that were yo-yoing in and out of precarious work? And if so, did they fit into any of your three categories? And then sort of my sort of second area of interest is, were there any age patterns in sort of how sort of these three categories sort of were being sort of shown across different workers? Thank you.
So the first one was escaping?
Yes. So anybody who escaped precarious work, and whether they yo-yoed back in, or whether that was...
Yeah. So with sort of exiting and yo-yoing, so during COVID-19, there were a lot of like corporate, I had some interviewees that were corporates, like they had established careers and they lost their job. There was a hiring freeze and they sort of did some temporary work and then they went back to their corporate career. But that's very rare and I think linked to COVID-19. In terms of yo-yoing, yo-yoing is a good way of putting it. I sort of call it surfing, but this is sort of basically the quintessential existence of the precarious worker, I think. And so this involves basically you take a few first jobs and you sort of bounce around and then you find a best job that kind of that you're okay with and you stay there for one person stayed there for 8 years, it's the longest job term, and then you get sick of it and then you go back into the contingent landscape and go and sort of find another job. So everyone's sort of moving through these different intensities of insecurity and temporariness. And yeah, and so in this way, precarity kind of becomes this idea of intensity. And age patterns, in the context of yo-yoing, so if someone's 50 and they've been yo-yoing since they were 20, then they would have gone through first, only, best in all these different ways. I interviewed a few older people, and I mean, one woman, you know, so she lost what job she had, and then she was sort of getting desperate and had to sort of was struggling to find work during COVID-19. And then she found this really great, not great, she found this agency that was great for her, and she was able to sort of find something to sort of keep her going. And she was, yeah, sort of around 50 or something. And so statistically, young people are much more likely to be in precarious work, so they're going to be more sort of you know, more common, but it can sort of affect anyone, and age sort of only affects people in terms of the experience that they have gathered and maybe savings and stuff like that.
Hi. I think I have final 2 questions for you. The first question is, I think there are many similar words. For example, there are precarity, precariousness, vulnerability, insecurity, uncertainty. So I think they seem to be synonyms and they can be used interchangeable. But how do you distinguish between them? And the second question is that because my research is about the precarious employment of highly educated young people. So I want to know if you have noticed any difference between how less educated people and more educated people, how they perceive the precarious jobs differently. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of terminology, precarity is the overall, it's the field of research, but it's also a condition that people live in. Precarious work cannot be defined. And then precariousness, I think I sort of associate most with the Judith Butler definition as the social vulnerability of codependence, or the vulnerability of codependence. And then the other terms, I think I just sort of use in a vernacular term, vulnerability. I'm sure it has like many definitions, but I'm just sort of using it in sort of a vernacular manner. And then in terms of highly educated, there's a factor where in one workplace, there's sort of a bunch of university graduates and there was a bunch of non-university graduates, and the university graduates were all really restless and upset with the job, and were kind of agitating and kind of fighting the management and stuff, and were generally much less happy. And the non-university graduates were just sort of happy to sit under the radar, do the least possible, and just sort of get through their shift. But the university graduates, they were dissatisfied with their job, but they were also putting in a lot more effort as well than other people, because there's sort of this desire that you really want to be effective and do all these things. And so basically it sort of comes down to the Fordist work ethic. And there's a really great book you should read by David Faruga, who's an Australian, where he talks about the post-Fordist self and in youth. And he talks about how people have different work ethics, and this is sort of more or less what I observed as well, where there's a certain restlessness among higher educated people.
That's great. Any more questions, anybody? Right, okay. Well, it remains me to just thank Krzysztof for his presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today, Krzysztof, and for your lovely paper. As I say, we've really enjoyed reading it and hearing about it today. Thank you, everybody, for your questions as well. We've got a lineup over the next couple of months for the reading group, so papers and details of that will be coming out shortly. If anybody is interested in presenting their papers at the reading group, do get in touch with us by email, and our details are also in the newsletter, and hopefully you've received that as well. So thank you very much, Krzysztof.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Recording
Thank
now.
you.